The forging of a katana begins in darkness and fire. In a workshop far from the capital, a master swordsmith rises before dawn, performs ritual ablutions, and dons the white robes of purity. What he is about to do is not merely craft, not simply the manipulation of metal and heat. It is a sacred act, a meditation, a prayer rendered in steel. He will take raw iron, fold it upon itself hundreds of times, hammer it, heat it, quench it, and slowly, over days or weeks, coax it into becoming something more than the sum of its materials. To understand the samurai, one must understand the sword, not as a weapon, though it was certainly that, but as a symbol of everything the warrior aspired to be. The blade's curve, that graceful arc like a new moon, represented the balance between strength and flexibility. Too rigid, and the sword would shatter under stress. Too flexible, and it would bend uselessly. The perfect blade found the middle path, yielding when it must, holding firm when necessary. The process of folding the steel, layer upon layer, created a blade that was both incredibly hard and remarkably resilient. Impurities were worked out with each heating and hammering. The resulting pattern on the finished blade, like flowing water or wood grain, was unique to each sword, as individual as a fingerprint. And in that uniqueness, the Japanese saw something profound. The sword as a living thing, possessing its own character, its own soul. A samurai typically carried two swords, the longer katana and the shorter wakizashi. Together they formed the daisho, and the right to wear both marked one as a member of the warrior class. To be separated from one's swords was to be stripped of identity itself. The blades were not mere tools to be set aside at day's end. They were extensions of the self, companions in life, and guardians in death. But possessing a fine sword meant nothing without the skill to wield it. From childhood, the samurai trained in kenjutsu, the art of the sword. Every morning, often before the sun rose, he would practice the fundamental cuts and blocks, repeating them until they were engraved into muscle memory, until the sword moved as naturally as breathing. There was a meditation in this repetition, a mindfulness required to perform each movement with perfect form, perfect balance, perfect awareness. As students advanced, they learned kata, choreographed sequences of attack and defense that encoded the wisdom of generations. These were not merely exercises, but repositories of technique, each movement containing lessons about timing, distance, and the flow of combat. A master could watch a student perform a kata and see everything: the quality of their focus, the depth of their training, the state of their spirit. Live combat, when it came, was nothing like the controlled environment of practice. Facing another person who wished to kill you, seeing the intent in their eyes, feeling your own heartbeat thunder in your chest, this was entirely different. And yet, paradoxically, the samurai trained to meet that intensity with calm. The teachings of Zen Buddhism were not separate from martial training. They were integral to it. Motion, no mind, was the ideal state for combat. Not emptiness or absence of thought, but a mind so clear, so present, that it could respond to threat without the delay of conscious decision. The opponent's sword begins to move, and yours is already rising to meet it, not because you chose to respond, but because response and threat are one continuous flow. This sounds mystical, even impossible, yet it is the experience reported by masters in every martial tradition. A state where time seems to slow, where perception expands, where action flows effortlessly from stillness. Achieving this state required more than physical training. It required the dissolution of fear, particularly the fear of death. The samurai spent hours contemplating mortality, not morbidly, but philosophically. Death was not the enemy. It was simply the end of a journey that had a beginning. And if one lived with honor, if one fulfilled one's duties, then death held no terror. It was simply the next step, to be met with the same calm awareness one brought to every other moment of existence. Picture two samurai meeting for a duel at dawn. They face each other across a field, hands resting on the hilts of their swords, not yet drawn. The moment stretches out, neither man moving. This is not hesitation. It is assessment, it is presence, it is the cultivation of that perfect clarity that will determine who lives and who dies. The first to move may gain advantage, or may reveal their intention and create an opening. And so they wait, breathing slowly, minds still as mountain lakes. When the swords finally flash from their scabbards, when steel meets steel with that distinctive ringing note, the fight is often over in seconds. All those years of training distilled into a handful of movements, into the precise distance of a strike, into the hair's breadth difference between a killing blow and a fatal mistake. There is no time for thought, no opportunity for fear or doubt. There is only action, pure and complete. And yet, remarkably, many samurai went their entire lives without ever drawing their swords in anger. The blade's presence was deterrent enough. The calm confidence of a trained warrior made conflict less likely, not more, because those who had truly mastered the way of the sword understood that not fighting was often the greater victory. To draw the blade was to accept the possibility of death, yours or another's. It was never done lightly, never done for pride or anger. In their homes, samurai kept their swords with reverence. The blade was cleaned and oiled regularly, protected from rust and damage with the same care one would give a sacred object, because it was sacred in a very real sense. It connected the warrior to his ancestors, who had carried it before, and to the descendants who would carry it after. The sword outlasted individual lives, becoming a repository of family memory and honor. At night, the sword rested near its owner, within arm's reach even in sleep. Not from paranoia, but from an understanding that danger could come at any moment, that a warrior must always be ready, even in the hours of rest. And when death finally came, whether in battle or peacefully after a long life, the samurai was often buried with his blade, that faithful companion that had never left his side. As sleep draws near, as consciousness begins to drift toward dreams, consider the paradox at the heart of the warrior's way. The sword is an instrument of death, yet it was revered as the soul of the samurai. In that contradiction lies a profound truth about the human condition. We are capable of terrible violence, and yet we long for meaning, for beauty, for transcendence. The samurai forged a path that acknowledged both aspects of human nature, that transformed the necessity of violence into an art form governed by honor and restraint. The blade is folded steel, nothing more. And yet, in the hands of a warrior who has disciplined himself through decades of training, who has contemplated death until it holds no fear, who has bound himself by oath and honor to protect rather than destroy, that piece of steel becomes something more. It becomes a mirror reflecting the soul of its bearer, and a reminder that even in the darkest aspects of human nature, there is the possibility of light. Picture, if you will, a land of mist-shrouded mountains and valleys, where morning fog clings to ancient cedar forests like whispered prayers. This is Japan in the 9th century, a realm where the old order is slowly unraveling, thread by careful thread, like silk pulled from a worn tapestry. The imperial court in Kyoto, that glittering center of poetry and ceremony, still shines with all the brilliance of cultured refinement. And yet, beyond the painted screens and perfumed halls, something is stirring in the provinces. Power, that most fluid of human constructs, is beginning to shift. To understand the samurai, we must first understand what they were not. They did not emerge fully formed, clad in lacquered armor with swords gleaming in the sun. They were not born from legend or divine decree. No, the samurai arose from something far more human, far more essential. The need to protect what one holds dear when the structures of authority begin to crumble. In those distant provinces, far from the capital's refined gardens and moon-viewing pavilions, wealthy landowners found themselves increasingly alone. The emperor's reach, once strong enough to bring order to every corner of the realm, had grown weak with distance and time. Tax collectors no longer arrived with imperial authority. Disputes over land and water rights went unsettled. And in that vacuum of power, as always happens in human affairs, those with strength began to impose their own order. These landowners, the daimyo as they would come to be known, needed protection. They needed men who could ride, who could fight, who could stand between their families and the chaos that threatened to consume everything they had built. And so they hired warriors. At first, these were simple armed men, farmers perhaps, who knew how to use a bow, or younger sons of noble families seeking purpose and fortune. They were given land, given rice, given a place at the table. And in exchange, they offered their swords and their lives. But something deeper was happening in those early years, something that would echo through the centuries. These warriors were not merely selling their skills. They were forging bonds of loyalty that transcended simple employment. When a man swears to protect another, when he stands between his lord and death, something sacred passes between them. The warrior becomes more than a servant. He becomes a shield, a sword, and in time, something approaching family. As twilight descends upon the valleys of ancient Japan, as the last light catches the edges of rice paddies turning gold with harvest, imagine those first warriors returning to their simple dwellings. Their hands, calloused from the sword and the plow alike, rest briefly before the evening meal. They do not yet know that they are becoming something new, something that will define a nation. They know only duty, loyalty, and the quiet satisfaction of a day spent in service to something larger than themselves. The word samurai itself comes from the verb saburao, which means to serve. In that simple etymology lies a profound truth. These were not conquerors seeking glory for its own sake. They were servants, bound by choice and honor to those they protected. And as the decades turned to centuries, as chaos gave way to order and then to chaos again, these servants would become the spine of a civilization, the bearers of a code that prized loyalty above life itself. In the quiet hours before sleep, when the mind drifts between waking and dreaming, it is worth contemplating this transformation. How does a hired guard become a symbol of virtue? How does the sword, an instrument of death, become a repository of the soul? The answers lie not in single moments, but in the accumulation of choices, in countless acts of discipline and sacrifice, in the slow forging of identity, through the fires of conflict and the cooling waters of contemplation. The samurai did not begin as heroes. They began as human beings faced with impossible choices in impossible times, and they chose to stand firm. In that choice, repeated generation after generation, a legend was born, not from myth, but from the far more powerful substance of lived experience, of honor maintained when it would have been easier to abandon it, of duty fulfilled when no one was watching to demand it. And so the story begins not with a clash of armies or the founding of a dynasty, but with the quiet resolve of men who understood that civilization itself rests not on laws or emperors, but on the willingness of individuals to hold fast to principle even when the world around them trembles. As morning mist rises from the valleys and the first birds begin their ancient songs, a young boy wakes in a simple dwelling. He is perhaps 7 years old, born into a samurai family of modest standing. Before the sun has fully crested the eastern mountains, he is already at his exercises. His small wooden sword cutting through the cool air in patterns his father has shown him 1,000 times. His muscles ache, his hands are blistered. But he does not stop, because this is not merely practice. This is the beginning of a transformation that will consume his entire life. To speak of Bushido, the way of the warrior, is to speak of something that cannot be fully captured in words. It was never codified into a single text that one could study and master like arithmetic or calligraphy. Instead, it emerged slowly over centuries, a distillation of Buddhist serenity, Confucian loyalty, and Shinto purity blended together into something uniquely Japanese, uniquely suited to them. Life of a warrior who must be prepared to die at any moment, yet live with grace and purpose until that moment arrives. Picture a mountain stream, cold and clear, flowing over stones worn smooth by centuries of patient water. Bushido was like that stream, shaped by the landscape it flowed through, adapting to every obstacle, yet always maintaining its essential nature. At its heart were 7 virtues, though even to number them seems to impose an artificial order on something that was meant to be lived rather than counted. First among these was rectitude or justice. A samurai had to be able to discern right from wrong with the clarity of a blade cutting through silk. This was not merely about following laws, for laws can be unjust, and the samurai served a higher principle. It was about an internal compass that pointed always toward what was proper, what was right, regardless of personal cost. When faced with a decision, a samurai was taught to ask not, "What will benefit me?" but "What is the right action?" And having determined the right course, he was expected to follow it without hesitation, even unto death. Courage naturally followed, for what use is knowing the right path if one lacks the strength to walk it? But the courage of Bushido was not reckless bravery or foolhardy risk-taking. It was a calm acceptance of danger, a willingness to face death without flinching, because one had already made peace with mortality. The samurai trained himself to be aware, always, that death could come at any moment, from an arrow in battle, from an assassin's blade, from simple illness or accident. This awareness did not paralyze him with fear. Instead, it freed him to live fully in each moment, to appreciate the beauty of cherry blossoms, precisely because they would soon fall. Benevolence seems an odd virtue for a warrior, yet it was considered essential. The samurai was not merely a killer, not simply an instrument of violence. He was a protector, and his strength was meant to shield the weak, not to oppress them. A true warrior treated those beneath him with kindness and those who served him with respect. When he drew his sword, it was not from anger or cruelty, but from necessity, from duty. And even in victory, he was expected to show mercy when mercy was appropriate, to remember that his opponent was also a human being, also someone's son or father. Respect flowed through every interaction, every gesture. The elaborate courtesy of samurai culture was not empty formality. It was an acknowledgement of the dignity inherent in all people, and a recognition that social harmony required each person to know their place and fulfill their role with grace. A bow was not mere habit. It was a moment of mindfulness, a physical expression of regard for another's worth. Honesty, particularly honesty with oneself, was prized above almost everything else. A samurai who lied, who deceived, who pretended to virtues he did not possess, was betraying not just others, but his own nature. Better to admit weakness and work to overcome it than to hide behind false strength. The path to improvement began with unflinching self-examination. Honor and loyalty were so intertwined as to be almost inseparable. A samurai's honor was his most precious possession, more valuable than life itself. And that honor was inextricably bound to his loyalty, to his lord, to his family, to his word. Once given, loyalty could not be withdrawn. A promise made was a sacred bond. To break it was to destroy oneself, to become something less than human. In the quiet hours of evening, after training, after duties, the samurai would often sit in meditation, not to escape the world, but to understand it more clearly. Zen Buddhism taught that enlightenment came not from books or doctrines, but from direct experience, from the simple act of being present. Sitting in stillness, breathing slowly, the samurai learned to quiet the chattering mind, to observe thoughts without being controlled by them, to find a center of calm that no external circumstance could disturb. This inner stillness was not separate from martial skill. It was the foundation of it. In combat, there is no time for conscious thought, no opportunity to deliberate or plan. The sword must move on its own, guided by training so deep it has become instinct. And that can only happen when the mind is clear, when fear and desire have been released, when the warrior acts not from ego, but from a place beyond ego. Imagine a pond at dawn, its surface perfectly still, reflecting the sky and trees with flawless clarity. That was the ideal state of the samurai mind, clear enough to perceive reality as it truly was, still enough to respond with perfect appropriateness to whatever circumstances arose. A ripple of fear, a wave of anger, and that clarity would be lost. And in battle, loss of clarity meant death. But Bushido asked for something even more difficult than facing an enemy's sword. It asked the samurai to live every day with the same intensity, the same mindfulness, the same commitment to virtue that he would bring to his final moment. Each action, no matter how small, was an opportunity to practice the way, serving tea to a guest with full attention and care, speaking truthfully even when a lie would be more convenient, treating a servant with the same respect one would show a lord. These small acts, repeated daily for a lifetime, forged character the way a smith forges steel, through patience, heat, and countless careful strikes. And when the time came, when disgrace loomed, or when capture seemed inevitable, the samurai had one final choice that remained entirely his own. Seppuku, ritual suicide, was not an escape, but a statement. It was a way to die with dignity, to take responsibility for failure, to cleanse dishonor through a final act of courage. The ceremony was precise, surrounded by ritual, witnessed by those who would remember. It transformed death from something that happened to you into something you chose. A last assertion of control, of will, of honor maintained even in the face of total loss. As night deepens and sleep approaches, consider this. Bushido was not a burden imposed from without, but a structure chosen from within, a framework that gave meaning to the chaos of existence, that transformed the brutal realities of feudal warfare into something approaching art, something that could ennoble rather than degrade those who practiced it. The samurai lived and died by impossible standards, and in that impossibility, in that constant striving toward an ideal they knew they could never fully achieve, they found a purpose that sustained them through centuries of conflict and change. In the quiet hours of evening, after training, after duties, the samurai would often sit in meditation, not to escape the world, but to understand it more clearly. Zen Buddhism taught that enlightenment came not from books or doctrines, but from direct experience, from the simple act of being present. Sitting in stillness, breathing slowly, the samurai learned to quiet the chattering mind, to observe thoughts without being controlled by them, to find a center of calm that no external circumstance could disturb. This inner stillness was not separate from martial skill. It was the foundation of it. In combat, there is no time for conscious thought, no opportunity to deliberate or plan. The sword must move on its own, guided by training so deep it has become instinct. And that can only happen when the mind is clear, when fear and desire have been released, when the warrior acts not from ego, but from a place beyond ego. Imagine a pond at dawn, its surface perfectly still, reflecting the sky and trees with flawless clarity. That was the ideal state of the samurai mind, clear enough to perceive reality as it truly was, still enough to respond with perfect appropriateness to whatever circumstances arose. A ripple of fear, a wave of anger, and that clarity would be lost. And in battle, loss of clarity meant death. But Bushido asked for something even more difficult than facing an enemy's sword. It asked the samurai to live every day with the same intensity, the same mindfulness, the same commitment to virtue that he would bring to his final moment. Each action, no matter how small, was an opportunity to practice the way, serving tea to a guest with full attention and care, speaking truthfully even when a lie would be more convenient, treating a servant with the same respect one would show a lord. These small acts, repeated daily for a lifetime, forged character the way a smith forges steel, through patience, heat, and countless careful strikes. And when the time came, when disgrace loomed or when capture seemed inevitable, the samurai had one final choice that remained entirely his own. Seppuku, ritual suicide, was not an escape but a statement. It was a way to die with dignity, to take responsibility for failure, to cleanse dishonor through a final act of courage. The ceremony was precise, surrounded by ritual, witnessed by those who would remember. It transformed death from something that happened to you into something you chose, a last assertion of control, of will, of honor maintained even in the face of total loss. As night deepens and sleep approaches, consider this. Bushido was not a burden imposed from without, but a structure chosen from within, a framework that gave meaning to the chaos of existence, that transformed the brutal realities of feudal warfare into something approaching art, something that could ennoble rather than degrade those who practiced it. The samurai lived and died by impossible standards, and in that impossibility, in that constant striving toward an ideal they knew they could never fully achieve, they found a purpose that sustained them through centuries of conflict and change. As autumn leaves spiral down from ancient maple trees, painting the ground in shades of crimson and gold, we turn our gaze to the great families of Japan, to the clans that would shape the destiny of a nation. Power in feudal Japan was not held by institutions or laws, but by families, by bloodlines that stretched back through generations, each name carrying with it the weight of history, honor, and ambition. These were not merely political entities. They were living organisms, bound by loyalty and blood, capable of tremendous unity and equally tremendous fragility. In the provinces, far from the refined but increasingly impotent imperial court, the daimyo ruled like kings in all but name. Each controlled vast territories, commanded armies of samurai, and maintained networks of allegiance that connected them to other families through marriage, treaty, and sometimes nothing more substantial than shared interest. The emperor in Kyoto remained the symbolic heart of Japan, divine and untouchable, but real power flowed through these regional lords and the warriors who served them. To understand the rise of the samurai as a true social class, we must understand the great clans that employed them and eventually became indistinguishable from them. The Taira and the Minamoto, two of the most powerful families in the 12th century, stood like giants across the landscape of Japanese politics. Both could trace their lineage to imperial ancestors. Both commanded the loyalty of thousands of samurai. And both were headed toward a collision that would drench the country in blood and reshape it forever. The conflict began, as these things often do, not with a single dramatic event, but with a slow accumulation of grievances, a gradual polarization of the political landscape. Court intrigues in Kyoto spilled over into military action in the provinces. Alliances shifted like sand in the tide. A slight to one family's honor would be answered, then answered again, each response escalating the tension until war became inevitable. The Genpei War, fought between 1180 and 1185, was more than a struggle for political supremacy. It was a crucible in which the identity of the samurai class was forged and refined. Before the war, samurai were warriors among others, valued but not unique. After the war, they would become the ruling class of Japan, the arbiters of power for the next 7 centuries. Picture the battlefields of that era, not the organized formations of later European warfare, but something more fluid, more personal. Samurai warriors on horseback, each announcing his name and lineage before engaging an opponent, seeking worthy adversaries rather than simply cutting down whoever stood before them. There was a ritualized quality to these encounters, a sense that even in war, honor and proper form mattered. One did not simply kill. One challenged, one fought according to understood rules, and one acknowledged the bravery of a fallen foe. And yet, for all the poetry and protocol, the Genpei War was brutal. Entire families were exterminated. Children were killed to prevent future revenge. The young Emperor Antoku, merely 6 years old, was drowned by his own grandmother to prevent his capture by the Minamoto forces. The red and white banners of the two clans became symbols that would echo through Japanese culture for centuries, representing not just those specific families, but the eternal nature of conflict itself. The decisive moment came at Dan no Wura, where the Taira made their final stand in a naval battle. The Minamoto forces, led by the brilliant tactician Minamoto no Yoshitsune, outmaneuvered their enemies, driving the Taira fleet into chaos. As their ships burned and sank, as warriors leaped into the sea rather than face capture, the old order passed away. The Taira, who had seemed invincible, were destroyed. The Minamoto stood triumphant. But victory in war does not always bring peace. Minamoto no Yoritomo, the head of the victorious clan, faced a challenge that had defeated many before him: how to transform military success into lasting political power. The emperor still sat in Kyoto, still commanded the theoretical loyalty of the nation. Yet everyone knew the reality. The sword, not ceremony, determined who truly ruled. In 1192, Yoritomo received from the emperor a title that would reshape Japanese history: Shogun, military commander. It was not a new title, but Yoritomo used it in a new way. He established his government not in Kyoto, but in Kamakura, far to the east. This physical separation was symbolic of a deeper division. There would now be 2 centers of power in Japan: the imperial court with its ancient legitimacy and cultural refinement, and the shogunate with its military might and practical authority. The system that emerged, known as the bakufu, or tent government, was essentially a military dictatorship, though that phrase does not quite capture its nuances. The shogun ruled through the loyalty of the daimyo, who in turn commanded the samurai. It was a pyramid of obligation and service, each level bound to the one above by oaths that were considered sacred. To betray one's lord was to commit the worst of sins, to become ronin, a wave man, untethered and dishonored. And yet, paradoxically, this system based entirely on personal loyalty proved remarkably unstable. The shogunate established by Yoritomo did not long survive his death. Other families rose to challenge for power. The Hoyo, the Ashikaga, each in turn would claim the title of shogun. Each would rule for a time, and each would eventually be displaced. For centuries, Japan would cycle through periods of relative peace and devastating civil war, through unity and fragmentation, through order and chaos. But through all these upheavals, the samurai remained. Dynasties rose and fell, clans emerged and disappeared, emperors came and went, yet the warrior class endured. They adapted to each new reality, pledged their loyalty to new masters, and maintained their code even as the world around them transformed. In this persistence, there is something almost miraculous, a testament to the power of an identity forged not on bloodline alone, but on shared values and mutual obligation. As the moon rises over the mountains and the villages below settle into the quiet rhythms of night, imagine those warriors of old, gathered around fires in military camps, speaking in low voices about battles past and battles to come. They served masters who might betray them, fought for causes they might not have chosen, and lived with the knowledge that death could arrive at any moment. And yet they found meaning in that service, dignity in that loyalty, and a kind of immortality in the code that bound them together across generations. The clans are gone now, their banners long since folded away, their castles empty or converted into museums. But the spirit they embodied, that willingness to subordinate individual desire to collective obligation, that commitment to excellence and discipline, that refusal to compromise honor even in the face of death, these things persist. They were not unique to Japan or to the samurai, but the samurai expressed them with a clarity and intensity that still resonates centuries later, still calls to something deep in the human spirit that longs for purpose larger than mere survival. In the 13th century, beyond the shores of Japan, a storm was gathering. Not a storm of wind and water, though that would come, but a storm of human ambition on a scale the world had never seen. The Mongol Empire, stretching from the Pacific to the gates of Europe, was the largest contiguous land empire in history. Under Kublai Khan, grandson of the legendary Genghis, the Mongols had conquered China, absorbed Korea, and now turned their gaze toward the islands that lay across the Eastern Sea. The demand, when it came, was delivered with the certainty of those accustomed to obedience. Kublai Khan sent emissaries to Japan bearing letters that were polite in form, but unmistakable in content. Submit to Mongol authority, pay tribute, acknowledge the Khan as supreme ruler, or face the consequences. To the samurai and the leaders of the Kamakura shogunate, the message was not merely a political challenge. It was an insult to everything they understood about honor, sovereignty, and the divine nature of their land. The Japanese response was silence, a refusal to even acknowledge the legitimacy of the demand. To reply would be to admit the possibility of submission. Better to say nothing at all. The Mongols, unused to having their commands ignored, prepared for war. Picture the moment when news reached the coastal provinces of Kyushu that a vast fleet had been sighted approaching from the west. Hundreds of ships carrying tens of thousands of warriors, Chinese, Korean, Mongol, an army that had conquered half the known world, now bearing down on the shores of an island nation that had never faced foreign invasion. The samurai who gathered to meet them had trained for battle all their lives, but they had fought only each other. Duels and skirmishes bound by unwritten rules of conduct and honor. What arrived on those beaches in 1274 was something entirely different. The Mongol way of war acknowledged no individual honor, no ritual challenge, no pause for identification and formal combat. They fought in coordinated units, using tactics refined through decades of conquest. Their archers fired in volleys, releasing arrows in such numbers that they darkened the sky. They employed explosive devices, primitive grenades that burst with terrifying noise and devastating effect. And they advanced in disciplined formations, infantry and cavalry working in concert, overwhelming their opponents through superior coordination rather than individual prowess. The samurai, accustomed to seeking out worthy opponents for one-on-one combat, found themselves cut down before they could even issue their formal challenges. The traditional cry, Azumasa, which announced one's name and lineage, meant nothing to an enemy who cared only for victory, not for honor. It must have seemed to those warriors that they faced not human opponents, but something more like a natural disaster, impersonal and overwhelming. And yet, they held. Through sheer courage and desperate determination, The Japanese defenders prevented the Mongols from establishing a solid beachhead. As evening fell on that first day of fighting, the invaders withdrew to their ships, planning to resume the assault at dawn. But the ocean had other plans. That night, a storm rose from the deep. Not the typhoon that would come in the second invasion, but significant enough. Winds lashed the Mongol fleet. Waves smashed vessels against rocks. Ships dragged anchors and collided in the darkness. When dawn broke, the invasion force was in disarray. Many ships had been damaged or destroyed. The commanders, facing an unexpected enemy more powerful than any army, made the decision to withdraw. To the Japanese, this was not mere meteorological fortune. It was divine intervention, proof that their land was protected by the kami, the spirits that dwelt in every mountain, river, and sacred place. The gods themselves had risen to defend Japan. This interpretation would be reinforced powerfully and definitively 7 years later. The second invasion of 1281 was no probing attack. It was the largest amphibious assault force assembled anywhere in the world until the modern era. Over 140,000 men on more than 4,000 ships, carrying supplies for an extended campaign, determined to succeed where the first invasion had failed. The Khan was not a man to accept defeat, and he had devoted enormous resources to ensuring that Japan would fall. The Japanese, for their part, had not been idle during those 7 years. They had built defensive walls along the coast, stone barriers that would make landing more difficult. They had organized their defenses, gathered supplies, and prepared spiritually through prayer and ritual at every temple and shrine. The entire nation braced for the coming storm. When the invasion fleet appeared on the horizon, it must have seemed to stretch from one end of the visible sea to the other, an armada so vast that its defeat appeared impossible. For weeks, the battle raged along the coast of Kyushu. The Japanese fought with desperate courage, launching raids in small boats against the Mongol fleet at night, harrying the invaders, preventing them from establishing a secure foothold. The defensive walls channeled the enemy into killing zones where samurai waited with bow and sword. But numbers eventually tell. The Japanese were exhausted, their supplies dwindling, their casualties mounting. The Mongols, for all the difficulties they faced, were slowly gaining ground. It seemed only a matter of time before the walls would be breached, the defenders overcome, and Japan would fall into the Khan's empire. And then the wind rose again. But this time, it was no ordinary storm. A typhoon of tremendous power, born in the deep Pacific and driven by forces beyond human control or prediction, descended upon the invasion fleet with apocalyptic fury. For 2 days and nights, winds that could tear trees from the ground and waves as tall as houses battered the Mongol ships. Vessels built for river warfare, not open ocean, broke apart like kindling. Soldiers drowned by the thousands, dragged down by their armor, or crushed between colliding hulls. When the storm finally passed, and the survivors limped away, abandoning the invasion entirely, more than half the Mongol force was gone, vanished beneath the waves, or scattered across the ocean. The Khan would never attempt another invasion of Japan. The cost was too great, the risk too high, and the lesson too clear. Some lands, it seemed, could not be conquered. To the Japanese, the storm was unambiguous proof of divine favor. They called it the kamikaze, the divine wind, a name that carried profound spiritual significance. Their land was sacred, protected not just by samurai swords, but by powers beyond the material world. This belief would shape Japanese identity for centuries. A sense that the islands were somehow special, somehow preserved by fate or divinity for a unique purpose. But the kamikaze had unintended consequences as well. The cost of defending against the invasions had been enormous. The Kamakura shogunate had promised rewards to the samurai who fought, but foreign wars bring no territorial spoils to distribute. Unlike civil conflicts, where land could be taken from defeated enemies and given to victorious warriors, repelling an invasion produces only debt and exhausted soldiers. Many samurai who had fought with tremendous courage received little or nothing in return, breeding resentment that would eventually help topple the Kamakura government. And yet, in the moment of victory, none of that mattered. Japan had faced the greatest military machine the world had ever known, and Japan had survived. Not through superior numbers or better weapons, but through determination, defensive ingenuity, and the intervention of forces that seemed to confirm what the people had always believed, that their land and their way of life were worth defending, that the gods themselves stood with them, and that no power on earth could overcome the combination of human courage and divine protection. As night settles over the modern coast of Kyushu, where cities now gleam with electric light and ships of steel pass safely through waters that once ran red with blood, it is worth pausing to remember those days when the fate of a nation hung in the balance, when samurai stood on beaches watching an unimaginable armada approach, knowing they were vastly outnumbered, knowing death was likely, and standing firm regardless. In that moment, the code they lived by was tested as it had never been tested before, and it did not break. The typhoons destroyed the invasion fleet, but it was human courage that held the line until the divine wind could blow. And in that partnership between mortal determination and forces beyond mortal control, the Japanese found a story that would sustain them through all the centuries, to come a reminder that sometimes the most important victories come not from conquest, but from the simple, profound act of refusing to yield. By the early 17th century, after generations of civil war had finally exhausted the nation, Japan found itself under unified rule once more. The Tokugawa shogunate, established in 1603, brought something Japan had not known for centuries: peace. The great castles that had been fortresses for warfare became administrative centers. The roads that had carried armies now carried merchants and pilgrims. And the samurai, whose entire identity had been forged in the crucible of conflict, found themselves facing a question they had never had to answer. What is a warrior without war? The Tokugawa imposed order with an iron hand, wrapping it in the silk of Confucian philosophy. The nation was divided into rigid social classes: samurai at the top, and farmers, artisans, and merchants at the bottom. Movement between classes was forbidden. The daimyo were brought under tight control, required to spend alternate years in the capital of Edo, leaving their families behind as hostages against rebellion. It was a system designed to prevent war, and it succeeded brilliantly. For over 2.5 centuries, Japan knew internal peace. But what happens to warriors in peacetime? The samurai still carried their swords, still held their privileged position, still received their stipends from the daimyo they served. Yet increasingly, their duties were administrative rather than martial. They became bureaucrats, managing rice production, collecting taxes, resolving disputes, maintaining records. The sword at their side remained a symbol of status, but for many, it would never leave its scabbard except for cleaning and practice. Some samurai embraced this transformation. They became scholars, studying Confucian texts, composing poetry, practicing calligraphy with the same intensity their grandfathers had practiced swordsmanship. They refined the tea ceremony into an art of profound subtlety, where every gesture carried meaning, where the simple act of preparing and serving tea became a meditation on transience, respect, and mindfulness. In these peaceful arts, they found a way to maintain the discipline and focus that had always defined their class, redirecting it from the battlefield to the scholar's desk and the tea house. Others struggled with the peace. For a warrior, the absence of war can feel like the absence of purpose. What meaning does training have if it will never be tested? What value does courage hold if there is no danger to face? These questions haunted many samurai, especially younger men who had never known actual combat, who carried swords they had never bloodied and practiced kata for battles that would never come. The irony was profound. The very success of the Tokugawa peace made the samurai class increasingly anachronistic. They consumed a significant portion of the nation's resources, receiving stipends that came from taxing the farmers and merchants they claimed to protect. Yet they produced nothing, and in the absence of war, arguably served no essential function. It was a contradiction that would eventually prove unsustainable. Then came the 19th century, and with it, the world. In 1853, American Commodore Matthew Perry sailed into Edo Bay with his black ships, steam-powered vessels that dwarfed anything in the Japanese fleet. His message was blunt: open your ports to trade or face military consequences. The Tokugawa government, recognizing they could not resist Western military technology, agreed to unequal treaties that granted foreign powers significant privileges in Japan. This capitulation shattered the mystique of the shogunate's authority. If the shogun could not protect Japan from foreign demands, what was the purpose of the shogunate? Discontent spread, particularly among samurai, who felt betrayed by what they saw as cowardice in the face of the Western threat. Some called for renewed isolation, others for aggressive modernization. The nation fractured along ideological lines, and the long peace began to crack. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 was less a revolution than a reorganization of power. The shogunate was abolished. The emperor, who had remained a symbolic figure for centuries, was restored to actual authority, or at least to the appearance of it. The new government embarked on a crash program of modernization, determined to transform Japan into a power capable of standing equal with the Western nations that had so recently humiliated it. And the samurai class, that ancient order of warriors, found itself targeted for elimination. It was not done out of cruelty, but out of practical necessity. A modern nation needed a modern military, one based on universal conscription and Western-style organization, not on a hereditary warrior elite. In 1876, the government issued a decree that would have been unthinkable just decades before. Samurai were forbidden to wear their swords in public. To understand the impact of this law, one must remember what the sword meant to the samurai. It was not merely a weapon or a symbol of rank. It was the soul made visible, the physical embodiment of honor and identity. To be denied the right to carry, it was to be denied identity itself. Many samurai felt this as a kind of death, perhaps worse than physical death, because it was a death of meaning, a negation of everything they had been taught to value. Some accepted the new reality and adapted. They became officers in the new conscript army, teachers in the emerging education system, businessmen in the rapidly industrializing economy. Their discipline and education made them valuable in these new roles, and gradually they merged into the broader fabric of modernizing Japan, their samurai identity becoming family history rather than lived reality. Others could not or would not adapt. In 1877, the last great samurai uprising occurred in Satsuma, led by Saigo Takamori, one of the architects of the Meiji Restoration, who had come to oppose the very changes he had helped initiate. For 6 months, a force of samurai armed with swords and traditional weapons held out against the modern imperial army with its rifles and artillery. It was a doomed rebellion from the start, a last gesture of defiance against the inevitable tide of change. The final battle, fought on the slopes of Mount Shiroyama, had the quality of deliberate tragedy. Saigo and his remaining followers, vastly outnumbered and out of ammunition, launched a final charge against the government forces. It was not a tactical decision. It was ritual, a chosen death that honored the old ways one last time. They died as samurai had always said they were prepared to die, with swords in their hands and their honor intact, even in defeat. With that final charge, the age of the samurai ended. Not all at once, not cleanly, but definitively. The social class was abolished. The privileges erased. The stipends ended. A new generation grew up in a Japan where samurai were history, not hierarchy, where the sword was a museum piece, not a mark of status. And yet, something persisted. Call it an echo, a memory, a cultural inheritance that could not be legislated away. The values that Bushido had encoded, discipline, loyalty, attention to detail, respect for hierarchy and expertise, these remained embedded in Japanese society. Schools taught students to approach their studies with the seriousness a samurai had brought to swordsmanship. Companies demanded loyalty from employees reminiscent of the loyalty samurai had shown their lords. The aesthetic sensibility that valued simplicity, precision, and mindful attention to the smallest details, these two endured. In the 20th century, as Japan navigated the challenges and catastrophes of modernity, the samurai became a source of national mythology, a past that could be invoked selectively to inspire, to justify, to provide continuity with a pre-modern identity. This nostalgia was not always benign. The rhetoric of samurai spirit was mobilized to justify militarism, to demand sacrifice from citizens in pursuit of national goals. The beautiful and the terrible intertwined, as they always had in the samurai tradition. But in quieter ways, too, the samurai legacy persisted. In the martial arts that preserved their techniques and philosophy, in the careful aesthetics of tea ceremony and flower arrangement, in the simple discipline of a craftsman perfecting his trade over decades, in the quiet satisfaction of duty fulfilled and honor maintained, the spirit of the warrior class lived on, transformed but recognizable. As our journey through the samurai era comes to its close, as sleep beckons and consciousness begins to drift, we might reflect on what this history offers us. The samurai were not superhuman. They were people shaped by their time and place, capable of great beauty and terrible violence, bound by codes that could elevate or constrain, living out the contradictions inherent in any attempt to find meaning in a world that often seems meaningless. They are gone now, those men and women who lived by the sword and the code. Their castles are empty, their banners furled, their swords displayed behind glass. But the questions they faced remain as current as ever. How does one live with honor in a dishonorable world? How does one maintain discipline and purpose when external structures collapse? How does one face the inevitability of death, and more challenging still, the uncertainty of life? The samurai offered one set of answers to these eternal questions. Not the only answers, perhaps not even the best answers, but answers, forged in the crucible of lived experience, refined over centuries, and expressed with a clarity and commitment that commands respect even now, even from those of us who live in a world so radically different from theirs that it would seem like magic to them. In the silence before sleep, in that liminal space between waking and dreaming, their shadows walk, still not as ghosts, but as memories, reminders of human possibility, of the capacity to choose discipline over chaos, loyalty over betrayal, honor over expedience. They were not perfect, but in their striving toward an impossible ideal, they created something that outlasted them, a legacy written not in stone but in spirit, passed down not through laws, but through stories enduring, because it speaks to something deep in the human heart that recognizes truth when it encounters it, even across the gulf of centuries. Rest now. The way of the warrior has been walked. The meditation on steel and spirit is complete. Tomorrow brings its own challenges, its own choices, its own opportunities to act with honor or to look away. But tonight, we remember those who chose to stand, to serve, to discipline themselves in pursuit of something larger than mere survival. We honor their memory, not by imitating their specific practices, which belong to their time, but by recognizing in their example the eternal challenge, to live with integrity, to face our fears, and to choose daily and deliberately to be better than we were yesterday. The cherry blossoms fall as they always do. The mountain stands as it always has. And in the space between, the human story unfolds, generation after generation, each finding their own way to walk with dignity through a world that offers no guarantees, no certainties, only the opportunity to choose, moment by moment, who we will be. Sleep well.